Victoria de Grazia. I'm the Moore Collegiate Professor of History, European History, and I'm also the director of the European Institute. I'm also a colleague of István's and a friend, so it's in those many, many capacities that I'm very pleased to welcome you to this discussion of his book, which is here and is also available on outside on sale for, afterward we can look at it. I want to thank, first of all, the co-sponsors of this event. The European Institute has collaborated very effectively, I hope, with the Harriman Institute, with the East Central European Center and its director, Alan Timberlake, who's here, with the Department of History at Columbia University, and with the Balassi Institute. And I want to thank very much Romesh, who's been such a good supporter of this event and other events. I also want to welcome some special guests in the audience this evening, including, of course, István Deák, his wife Gloria Deák, also an historian, gifted historian, and their daughter Eva, who's here. And we're also very honored to have Hungary's new Consul General in New York, Ambassador Ferenc Kuman, in the audience. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you're here. Now, this evening, we have an extraordinary book and an extraordinary panel of speakers to discuss the book, Europe on Trial. Let me just say, in the way of a modest beginning of a couple of hours where we'll gradually expand and go into depth and take many perspectives and then open up also to your questions, that it is a remarkable book. It's remarkable in its scope and scale. That is, it's Europe, all of Europe, a very big Europe during World War II. It's a book about problems which actually haven't been viewed together in many ways. That is, collaboration, resistance, and retribution. And seeing them with an extraordinary historical perspective, with enormously magnanimous, or shall I say almost a very passionate kind of equanimity, provocative equanimity, to see them together and to not draw any easy judgments about a terrain which has been filled with most extraordinarily difficult, complex debates, probably the most difficult in 20th century European history, perhaps European history in general. So, discussing the book, before I turn it over to István, who will give a sort of capsule summary of what he thinks he thought he was doing here, I want to introduce the three speakers. The fourth, fortunately, Ian Baruma, sends his regrets. He's sick, in bed. He couldn't come, and we told him we miss him very much. So László Borhi, scientific counselor of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and guest researcher at Indiana University, who is an expert on these questions in another context, that is addressing Hungary in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. In 2006, for his historical research, he was awarded the Gold Cross of Merit of the Hungarian Republic. I want to introduce Holly Case, who's an historian of Europe at Cornell University, specializing in East Central and Southeastern Europe. Her work is very wide-ranging, focusing on the relationship between foreign policy, social policy, science, and literature. Her book on Between States, the Transylvanian Question and the European Idea during World War II was published in 2009. She's also done a wide range of other works focusing on occupied Europe. Robert Paxton, colleague in the history department, Mellon Professor Emeritus at Columbia University, has worked life as an historian, in many ways engaged with these very same questions. The most important first book on Vichy France, which in effect discovered French collaboration, Old Guard and New Order. He then wrote very widely on occupied Europe, Nazis and the Jews, and more recently, not his last book by any means, a important book on the anatomy of fascism. So we have our interlocutors will each speak for 10, even more minutes because Jan is not here. But very first, István, if you could say some words about the structure of the book. Thank you.
Good evening, Victoria. Thank you very much for organizing this conference. I'm really spoiled because it's the third time or maybe the fourth time that many friends get together here to hear about my modest book. Victoria just asked me now to sum up my book, which I have never done in my life. Can you hear me? Is there a problem? No. I never summed up my book. I thought that it would speak for itself, but of course one has to be able. So yes, it is about collaboration, resistance, and retribution in the worst period, perhaps, in European history. The one sentence that sums up the whole thing as an introduction is that Europe failed the test. And in fact, in the Hungarian version, which will hopefully come out in this year, I already used the expression sort of a failed test. Why is one of the problems? But the fact of the matter is that the European countries, less and less democratic in the interwar period, and almost, not always, but generally non-democratic by the beginning of World War II. But even the democratic countries failed to understand the danger of German expansion. Many Europeans were enchanted by the dictators, especially Mussolini, but also Hitler. They did not understand the danger, and they let it happen to them. There were ample opportunity for the Europeans to understand what was coming to them. If nothing else, the heads of state, the statesmen knew about the German discontent under Hitler, the fear of war. The German general staff was full of people who were terrified of the war and who were planning to overthrow Hitler if only the West would show some understanding. Nothing of that happened. There was no resistance to Hitler. The European countries, and this is something that I feel very strongly, and maybe will dispute it, but I still feel many European countries made it absolutely clear to the Nazis that they would not resist them. And the choice example, which I always use, and that sounds always a little bit outrageous, the choice example is Denmark, which made clear by the true movement of its troops in 1940 that they would not resist, and they would let in the Germans in exchange for tremendous privileges. Denmark was the most privileged occupied country next to the Czech Republic, the Czech protectorate during World War II. And that brings me one of the other major themes of the book. What is the purpose of a statesman? What is the duty of a citizen in such conditions under foreign occupation? Are they to resist or not? Is their purpose to keep as many citizens alive and in decent conditions as possible at the price of cooperating with the enemy, the occupier? Or is their purpose to save national honor, to save personal honor, to defy dictatorship, to defend democracy, and perhaps ultimately also help the Allied cause? And the counterexample to this, to the Danish case, is the Polish case. The Poles, as you know, paid a tremendous price for this, for their resistance, for their unwillingness to surrender, although one has to add that the Poles were not even given the chance to collaboration and cooperation. Then I talk about the different form of cooperation, a collaboration with the occupiers or with the friends, because Germany, after all, in 1940-41, had many, many associates, many friends, many allies in Europe. I would say had more allies than non-allies, because many of the occupied countries like France, Vichy France, was desperate to be a friend of Germany. There were very few countries that were not friends of Germany. So that the Europeans quite willingly, and I call it the holidays Europe, the best period as far as the Europeans are concerned, because now there is a European unity under German leadership, and they will be moving toward a happier future. This soon changed because, not so much because of the nature of the German occupation, which in Western Europe at least was not worse than military occupations generally are, but changed because the Germans, after all, had exactions. They had to fight the war, and they demanded money, goods, and ultimately also labor from the West. And that labor is what changed, began to change things, because the French, for instance, the French youth were asked to work in Germany, which wouldn't have been so terrible, but still was abroad, was strange, was dangerous. So many French youngsters decided not to cooperate, and that's the beginning of the resistance in France and in many Western European countries. But it did not become a mass movement until the decisive date, Stalingrad. And that also allows me for a few minutes, perhaps a few seconds, to say how terribly important Eastern Europe, how terribly important the Eastern Front was in the war, how terribly important the Soviet Union was. First as the ally of the evil power, as another evil power, the alliance of Germany and Russia was allowed the Germans to take over Europe. But then the German attack on the Soviet Union changed everything, and the war was really a war in the East, in which the West played a very minor role, even after the Normandy landing. So I'm also trying to persuade the young people who hopefully will read this book that they have to take a more careful view, not listen to the American television programs which say that the war was won in Normandy. The war was not won in Normandy. Nor did the resistance win the war. It's the Soviet Union that primarily won the war for everybody else. Like it or not, this is what happened. So many people then joined the resistance in different forms. It could be nothing but writing a few pamphlets, secretly displaying an insignia of one's queen. It could be also much more than that. It could be armed resistance. Armed resistance in the West was not very significant, and militarily was not important. It was much more important in terms of helping the Allies, or helping with information, helping the escaped prisoners of war, and similar things. Armed resistance in the East was terribly important in some countries, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, and of course in the occupied part of Soviet Union and Poland. But that was immediately complicated from the very beginning by what accompanied it, and that was ethnic war and civil war. So it's hard to talk to only of resistance. Now one cannot talk only about resistance if the resistance at the same time for waging war against their compatriots, who might have been of a different nationality, or might have been so-called collaborators. The choice example is Yugoslavia, where the communists were one force, the Chetniks were another force, and nobody really can tell whether a Chetnik was a collaborator of the Germans or the enemy of the Germans. Some were both. Next point I would like to make, many people, many Europeans were both. Many were first collaborators and later resistance. Many French engineers, industrialists were very keen on working with the Germans because it was very profitable. By 1944, many French workers, French cheminot, railroad workers were against the Germans for many reasons. But one of them was opportunism. They saw that the Germans would be losing the war, and one wanted to have some brownie points. It's very hard, therefore, to be generalized about the resistance or anything else. The essence is that there was more resistance by 1944-45, and it is the resistance which generally came to power in 1945 in both Western and Eastern Europe. What happens to them later is another story. It's not a very glorious, not a very happy story, but in 1945 they opened the way to a happier time. Am I too long? Yes. No? Well, that's it. The collaboration was a very interesting phenomenon because it included very interesting, sometimes attractive intellectuals, and especially in France, but of course it also included a lot of scum of the earth. And the final point, the retribution should not be underestimated, A, because it involved an enormous number of people, millions of people, which today is hard to imagine. At one point, I just jokingly calculated that the retribution in Norway and other countries that went down in history as great resistors of the Nazis, Norway, if as many Americans would have been tried, would be tried today for working for the enemy, about 30 million Americans would be imprisoned. That was happened in Norway, for instance, and more or less the case in the other countries. But it doesn't mean that it was always just, and it doesn't mean that it always achieved its purpose of creating a better and especially socialist Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Istvan, and thank you for writing the book, and thanks for starting us off. Very characteristically, Istvan refers to this as a modest book. Don't believe a word of it. It's a unique book because although there are quite a few books about Europe in World War II, and there are even some important books about Central and Eastern Europe in World War II, there are very few that cover the entire continent, and there's none, I feel sure I can affirm, that there is none that has the combination of personal experience and scholarship that this one does, because Istvan, of course, saw a good bit of this at first hand. And then he spent a lifetime reading in 4 or 5 languages everything that has ever been written on the subject. So it's a very remarkable book. It shatters a number of easy images that we have of the war in retrospect, and particularly in comparison with some of our more recent wars, which have been ambiguous and not very satisfying in every way. This one, in retrospect, at least for Americans, seems very satisfying, and is full of clean images of perpetrators on the one side and victims on the other. And Istvan knows from personal experience and from his reading that it's infinitely more complicated than that, and particularly in Eastern and Central Europe, there were not only the immense armies of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, but internal score settling, ethnic cleansing, frontier expanding or frontier contracting, inner wars of aggression, and of getting rid of unwanted populations. It is a much more complicated subject than that. The image that occurred to me is that the great contending, is as if the great contending armies, the Nazi and the Soviet, had kicked over an anthill and released this enormous energy built up in Central and Eastern Europe by generations of conflict and competition among language and ethnic groups. And so there are great differences between East and West, and there are great differences in time, because this book is also important because it doesn't try to take a snapshot of the war. There are time phases. And first of all, the Germans appear to have won. It seems almost unthinkable that the Germans have not won. And you either collaborate or at least accommodate, simply to live, to get by. You go to work in the morning, and that is a kind of collaboration, and you do it. It's certainly a kind of accommodation. And then comes, particularly after Stalingrad, a period of doubt, and resistance begins to seem possible. And finally, at the end, there's the rush of liberation carried out in a state of intense emotion and a desire to punish the people who were guilty of treason back at the beginning. So it's a very dramatic story. It's a relatively short book, and so an enormously dramatic, complex story made clear, that is to say, made more complex than it used to be in the compass of one volume. I'm not going to talk about all of it. I thought I would devote my few minutes to two of the aspects of this book that struck me as particularly salient, hoping that my colleagues will have singled out other aspects of this book to comment on. The first thing I'd like to comment on is István's finding that the Nazis couldn't have run Europe by themselves. They had to have help. There is the image abroad, and particularly in France, that there was a German behind every tree and under every bed, and they gave orders and everybody else more or less obeyed, except for a few foolhardy people who were soon eliminated. But they simply didn't have the manpower to do it, particularly after the Eastern Front opened up in June 1941, and the Germans were pulling troops out of Western Europe as fast as they possibly could, and had to make do in the West with a fairly thin coverage, and troops recruited from almost everywhere you can imagine. There was a Hindu regiment in charge of occupying Bordeaux, for example. You can think about that one for a few minutes. That's called really needing more people. And I was delighted to see István take this tack, because I've spent a lifetime trying to do the same thing for Vichy France. The Germans could not hold down France by themselves without creating shortages in other parts of the empire. They couldn't do it all, and so they elected, and this is very, very clear. There's a famous meeting between Hitler and Mussolini on the 18th of June, 1940. Up in London, de Gaulle was speaking on the BBC at the, I think it was at the Brenner Pass. Hitler was explaining his intentions to Mussolini, and he said, this is 18th of June, this is a week before the armistice. I know the French don't like this war, and I'm going to offer them a peace that will persuade them not to move their government overseas, and that way we will have offer them an unoccupied zone. That way it will be very inexpensive. We won't have to use very much manpower or very much money to keep them going. We'll give them enough leeway, and they'll run things the way we want. Mussolini says, no, I want Tunis, I want Mentone, I want the Alps. And Hitler said, now, calm down. My way is much better. And since Mussolini hadn't actually managed to conquer anything anyway, he had to go along. And so I was very interested in my work in the German archives to come across a German administrator who was a kind of intellectual theorizer of occupation systems, and who wrote some extremely interesting memoranda about how a country the size of Germany, which was a middle-sized country even by European standards, it could run the entire conquered area. And he came up with the very intelligent idea that you didn't run it all in the same way. You adapted yourself to local conditions, and but never for a moment losing sight of the main goal, which was to establish Germans as the master race and treat everybody else either as willing cooperators or as useless populations that would have to be exterminated. And Best was a well-educated lawyer, but it's perfectly clear that he contemplated the extermination of Jews and Slavs, even at an early date in the war. But there's a very interesting memorandum from him. He was quite close to Himmler. He had helped Himmler in 1939 set up the German police system. And then he was sent to France as the number 2 person. There was a general at the top, General von Struppnagel, and he had 2 assistants. One was this man, his name was Werner Best. Werner Best ran the civil administration, and next to him was Colonel Speidel, who, as many of you know, became a NATO commander after the war. Werner Best became the attorney for major West German corporations after the war. But leave that aside. Werner Best theorized that to have a huge occupied area with all manner of different cultures and all manner of different dispositions toward Germany within it, you had to have 4 types of administration. One of them was associative administration, and the case there was Denmark, which we've already heard about. Then the next category was supervisory administration, Aufsichtsverwaltung in German. You leave the local government in place, and you just make sure things are going right, and you nudge where things need to be nudged, and you let the local administration run things. It's much cheaper, and they know where all the bodies are, and so it works better that way. The examples there, of course, are France and Belgium. And then he had a category that he calls ruling administration, Regierungsverwaltung, which would include the Bohemia, Moravia, where they meant to change things much more radically. They didn't think they would change anything much in France, just make it work to supply them with lots of food and wine and iron ore and manufactured goods. But the Czech, Bohemia, Moravia, they expected to change things and move populations around. So you make a much more extensive change in things. And finally, the last category is called colonial administration. And that's the places where you plan to just clear out the local population and move in German settlers. Poland would be the main case. Poland, Ukraine. Werner Best was extremely proud of his achievements as number 2 man in France, which he regarded as the key example of Aufsichtsverwaltung, of supervisory administration, and he proved it by sending off to Berlin a report showing how few people it took to run these various countries. There were a little under 3,000 German civil administrators in France in the spring of 1941, the fall of 1941. There were more than 3,000 civil administrators in Holland, which is a much smaller country, because there they had a much more active occupation policy. In Bohemia, Moravia, they had 18,000. There they really meant to do things. And in Denmark, they just had a few hundred. But Werner Best thought he had served his country wonderfully well, using a minimum of manpower to organize this very rich country of France, certainly the richest of the conquered countries, and mobilizing it almost entirely for support for the German war effort. So Istvan, I think, has understood equally well how the German administrations adapted themselves to different kinds of settings, never losing sight of the goal, which was to have the master race control the whole thing and subjugate where they could and eliminate where they had to. The second interesting thing I'll comment on in the short time I think I should take is the contrast between East and West. Particularly those of us who are Americans are closely focused on the Western European experience, and as Istvan has already said, we believe that D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge were the crucial moments in the war. They were sideshows. 2/3 of the German army was in the Eastern Front the whole time, including June 1944. But that's only one of the great differences. The other great difference was that the occupied countries in Western Europe had, for centuries, been working toward the Western model of the homogeneous nation state, a state where pretty much everyone speaks the same language and has the same ethnic composition and shares the same identity. And the Western European countries had a few border issues. There are the Bretons and there are the Scots and so forth, but they were not life-threatening. The Basques, these are not, do not put the new states at risk. Now, the new states that were created after 1918 almost entirely, perhaps entirely, contained vastly different ethnic groups, language groups, identities. The peacemakers around Wilson had tried very hard to shape frontiers to ethnic realities. And it was almost laughable to even try, because not only were there no clear frontiers, a vast number of the people didn't really fit any category. They were intermarried, they spoke 2 dialects, they didn't know which census to answer to, and you couldn't draw this kind of boundary. So they drew boundaries which were like tinder boxes ready to go up in flames. And when the war came and the fighting came, it opened up all of that volatile material, and people began attacking each other underneath the Nazi-Soviet war. Now, I think István has dealt with these layers of enmity, these layers of hospitality with great brilliance. I was thinking back to Tim Snyder's Bloodlands, which is a very moving and powerful book, but it has a strange quality of absence, because all the evil deeds are done by the Nazis and the Soviets, and nothing much seems to be happening on the ground. And István has filled in all those spaces brilliantly, and it's wonderful to see this. Now, in Western Europe, it seems to me it's not simple, though, and I'm sure István doesn't mean that it was simple, because an occupation inevitably opens up internal divisions and offers opportunities for outgroups, groups who are resentful opponents, to come in and take their revenge. And in France, it was not over ethnic differences or linguistic differences, as I say, the Brittany flirtation amounted to nothing. It was over class differences and cultural differences between left and right. And if you had to come up with one phrase to encapsulate what the Vichy regime was up to, it was revenge for the Popular Front. It included within it all sorts of different trends, pacifist, anti-communist, right-wing, Catholic, conservative, but they all shared the aim of getting their revenge for the government formed in 1936 by Léon Blum, the first socialist and the first Jew ever to be Prime Minister of France. And so the Vichy regime was busy undoing everything the Popular Front had done, and the Germans were quite indifferent to that, as long as the coal got delivered and the wine and food got delivered and so forth. And so there's a similar phenomenon. It isn't over ethnic quarreling, but it's over settling of old scores within the French system too. And so you see all of that happening. I guess before I end, I'd like to make one remark about the defeat in 1940. István sometimes seems to be saying that no one even tried to beat Hitler. I think that's going a little far. This is a book almost uncriticizable, but let me enter. It's the job, is it not, of the commentator to comment. The First World War, we don't start with the First World War, but the people who were living there certainly remembered it was only 20 years behind, millions of dead, and they simply couldn't face doing it again. They did, in fact, do rather a lot, and it was so dominated by the desire to avoid casualties, that it was very easy for a mobile military force like Hitler's 10 Panzer divisions to find a weak spot and crunch through. And although the French had equal numbers of most kinds of equipment, although the French tanks were better, you can see me after class, and I'll tell you more about that. Much of the French equipment was good, and in one or few cases better, but it was used wrong. The French would just form up in a defensive line, and once the Germans had gotten past them, there was nothing they could do. And but they tried. The other thing that I need to add is that during the Depression, the French government and most of the democratic governments practiced austerity. They believed that the only way to cure a sick economy was to cut the budget to the point where revenue equaled outgo. And very little money was spent on the armed forces in 1933 through 1935. Only when Blum came in 1936 did he begin, in a rather small way, but begin to seriously rearm. And toward the end, and Istvan says this, it's now known, the French output in military equipment was running slightly ahead of the German in the spring of 1940, but then it was too late. So I'll stop there and we can go on with other matters later.
So thanks to you all for coming, to my fellow panelists and the organizers. Above all, I'd like to thank my mentor and friend István Deák for writing this book and for making me possible. So in using the historian's craft to place Europe on trial, István Deák has induced in me a kind of vertigo. And it's not that there's no moral center to the book. Deák tells us that Europe did badly on trial, describing what he calls the European-wide crisis in compassion and humanity that characterized the war years. It's also not for lack of agents in control of their own destiny. In fact, Deák considers many of the states that have long made a habit of casting themselves as victims of Nazi Germany, not least of which his own native Hungary, as free agents in control not only of their own destinies, but more importantly, over the destinies of their inhabitants, generally a control they exercised to no good end. The vertigo comes instead from another source, and that is what I consider to be a remarkable tension in the book between the desire to understand people's behavior and decisions during the war, on the one hand, and on the other, to condemn it. So the 19th century German philosopher Hegel famously described world history as Weltgericht, which means two things, famously. It means both the world's court of justice and the final judgment. So if it's been the historian's task to judge, it sometimes has also been the law's task to understand. One of the U.S. prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials, a man by the name of Whitney Harris, wrote that, quote, "The purpose of the Nuremberg trial was not merely or even principally to convict the leaders of Nazi Germany and affix a punishment upon them commensurate with their guilt. Of far greater importance was the making of a record of the Hitler regime which could withstand the test of history." So the historian judges, the judge writes history, and it seems that World War II in particular invites this apparent role reversal. And maybe it's because World War II was what Deák calls an ideological conflict. People do all kinds of things under the influence of ideology, rather like alcohol. The test of a defendant's sanity has historically been whether the accused at the time the crime was committed could tell the difference between right and wrong. But what if your ideology, i.e. Nazism, tells you that it's right to kill Jews? As the renegade Hungarian-born psychiatrist Thomas Saz put it, quote, "Genuine scientific causal theories make it unnecessary and, in fact, impossible to assign moral blame to a person," unquote. The principle of causality, he continues, if applied rigorously, yields two completely incompatible conclusions. The first is that insofar as it is always possible to regard antecedent events as explanations of human behavior, men should never be blamed or praised for what they do. Second, that insofar as men are human beings, not machines, they always have some choice in how they act, hence they are always responsible for their conduct. Neither of these conclusions is verifiably more correct than the other, Sass admits, but he picks responsibility as the more just, the more moral point of view. And this moral point of view, the one that pronounces judgments, surfaces a lot in Deak's book. But the scientific side, the one that seeks to understand, is also there. To understand is not to exonerate, however. Throughout Europe on Trial, Deak implicitly insists, as Hannah Arendt did in her famous work on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, that, quote, human beings be capable of telling right from wrong, even when all they have to guide them is their own judgment, which, moreover, happens to be completely at odds with what they must regard as the unanimous opinion of all those around them, unquote. Simply stated, ideology or mass insanity are no excuse. We are human beings who should know better. In the foreword to Europe on Trial, the historian Norman Neymark writes that, quote, imperfect as it often is, history itself may be the best means of all to seek justice, but the craft of history requires the readiness to accept ambiguity and the imperfectibility of human behavior. It means understanding the challenges faced by victims, perpetrators, and those in between, and it demands respect for the facts as we know them, unquote. In other words, history is a kind of justice, but a justice reached through understanding. We are confronted ever more at universities and in society more generally with the claim that the humanities have no practical relevance. But Europe on Trial, displaying as it does the humanistic thinker's ability and willingness to play two roles at once, to be both scientific and moral, to be both judge and historian, I think belies that claim. A current trend in neuroscientific research, by contrast, claims simply that, quote, all behavior is mechanical, all behavior is produced by chains of physical events that ultimately reach back to forces beyond the agent's control, unquote. Ergo, no one is ever really to blame. The human being is simply a machine, and we are all merely machine men with machine minds, as Charlie Chaplin sarcastically intoned at the end of his 1940 film, The Great Dictator. So we must leave it to Deak's readers, that distinguished jury of peers, to decide whether the protagonists in World War II were executing algorithms or human beings, and whether we think it matters. But while we might conclude that our historians should act as judges and our courts should gather the evidence on the basis of which we write our histories, I think we must also probe, test, and cross-examine the judgments pronounced by historians and the evidence they use to do it. In that spirit, then, I would like to close with a brief foray into the realm of cross-examination. First, collaboration is not a term innocent of politics. As a matter of fact, the Jews were charged with collaboration with the Soviets during World War II by the Nazis. In fact, condemning by association with charges of collaboration is the spirit in which not just the Jews, but other various groups in Europe were persecuted, and not only in Hitler's Europe, but in Stalin's Europe. And so should we not then be a little more wary of the term, or at least a little more wary of the political charges that it carries, its unquestionable relationship to power? So there are a lot of victims and even more perpetrators in Deak's account. Almost all of them he associates primarily with nations, and nations in turn with states. It is the French who don't resist after the initial occupation, the Dutch who hand over their Jews, and the Danes who don't, the Serbs who kill both partisans and Germans, etc. If people's behavior maps so neatly onto their nationality, what is it that we're seeing? Is it a national mentality, or the particular circumstances of the occupation or the war? And how do we arrive at a theory of individual agency if we accept either of those explanations? Do we seek to inculcate individuals with the lessons of individual heroism and cruelty, with stories of national heroism and national cruelty, of state heroism and state cruelty? Or do we simply do all in our power to make sure that individuals, nations, and states will never be put to that sort of test again on the grounds that we can pretty well assume that they will fail it? Finally, Deák ends the book on a rather triumphalist note, one that praises the achievements of European unification and of the United States, particularly at Nuremberg. But it's noteworthy that the atomic bomb is only mentioned in the context of the wartime concern about the Germans getting it and the post-war concern about the Soviets getting it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki do not come in at all. Can a discussion of collaboration, resistance, and retribution in World War II Europe dispense with the treatment of the global scope of the war? Deák mentions the relatively low numbers of both participants and casualties in the great battles of the war in the Pacific relative to Europe. How do we account for those differences? What makes the European experience so unique? And where does the uniqueness bleed into similarity, especially given the Asian and other anti-colonial resistance movements that were learning important lessons from World War II, and the former Axis soldiers who later fought them after joining the ranks of the French Foreign Legion? Or Deák himself mentions a wonderful, kind of horrifying instance of former French resistance fighters going on to fight in Algeria against those who would throw off the French Empire. In other words, when should a story about European World War II collaboration, resistance, and retribution rightfully end? If Carl Schmitt is writing his theory of the partisan based on observations regarding World War II resistance activity in 1962. As regards the European Union, Deák rightly notes that some collaborationists during World War II had dreamed of a new, unified, and better Europe. Should the fact that people who continue to imagine such a thing under the Nazis later imagine the same thing under the EU reveal the potential of a darker side of European unification that we might well be served to approach with due caution? Should we, for example, be concerned that the current Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, who has articulated a program of illiberal democracy, saw joining the European Union as a way of reuniting all Hungarians in a single state, in the very same way his World War II predecessors saw that unification happening within the Axis alliance? Finally, I'd like to address a question raised by Professor Paxton, this issue of East and West. I think what I'm observing of late is something of a marginalization of Western Europe in the historiography of World War II. And I would like, one of the theories that Professor Paxton raises, which I think is interesting, is that one of the key differences is that in the West you have class and cultural conflicts. In the East you have more ethnic ones. And this, in some respects, goes to the root of why I'm both excited as an East Europeanist that Eastern Europe is finally, marginalizing Western Europe. On the one hand, it's exciting to be at the center of history. On the other hand, it's not so nice to be considered at the center of history as a bloodland. This goes back to some of the older tropes in historiography that consistently claim that this is a knotted-up tangle of scrambled nationalities that can never seem to pull out of their ethnic hatreds. And I think Deák does a wonderful job of pointing out that a lot of the ethnic issues also map onto class issues in East Central Europe. So how do we separate the issue of ethnicity and class, and how do we confront the matter of Eastern Europe sort of coming to the fore in the historiography of World War II? So I look forward very much to the discussion. I imagine it's going to be a difficult one on a difficult topic, and so indeed it should be. Thanks.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this very prestigious and wonderful invitation. I was more than happy to come, all the more so because, and this is on a more personal note, Professor Deák's, or István's, if I may, book that was published in Hungarian in the 1980s launched me on my career as a historian, for better or for worse. Because he taught me, in the midst of numerous ideological and virtually unreadable books published in communist Hungary, that it is worth thinking and reading about history. And his new book also breaks with long-standing canons and forces us to think about the most profound issues of human existence. And I'm very grateful that I have the chance to read and comment on this book, and hopefully I'll also do so in writing. It is very difficult to pick out any of the topics to comment on because there are so many intriguing issues that István made us think about. I selected three. Maybe they are interrelated, maybe they're not, but I don't really believe in historical patterns and historical evolution. I think that historical events are unique and do not recur. The first one is it worth resisting an evil occupier like Nazi Germany or the Stalinist Soviet Union? And István selected, one of his choices is very interesting. It's Warsaw. And intuitively, you would think that the brave people, the Jews, and then the Christian segment of the Warsaw population were completely justified in rising up because they were facing biological annihilation. So what choice did they have? The Jews in 1943, perhaps even less than the Christian Poles of 1944. And what really separates East from West is that the French, the Dutch, the Belgians had every right to expect that they would be liberated and freedom would be brought in the stead of occupation. Not so in Middle Europe. Romanians, Hungarians, Poles were facing an invasion by an equally repressive totalitarian regime. And they had very little choice than to resist. And this is where, as Sándor Márai put it, the great Hungarian bourgeois writer, the Soviets brought liberation but did not bring freedom. And this is the stark choice the Poles had to face in 1944, the last opportunity to take their own fate into their own hands. Now, of course, as István explains, the results were horrifying. Tens of thousands of innocent civilians were murdered by German and other ethnic soldiers who were on a rampage. And the city was virtually, in the Carthaginian sense, razed to the ground. Of course, the opposite option is President Beneš's choice in 1938, 1939, when despite the fact that the Czechoslovak Joint Chiefs were ready to resist the invading German forces, Beneš refused to do so. And in 1945, as he was standing on the balcony of the famous Hrad, the Prague Castle, he pointed to the panoramic, wonderful view of the city to his guests and said, "I saved my city from destruction." The two choices, the moral superiority of resistance and physical destruction, and the reprehensible cowardice, as if you want to put it that way, of the Czechs, but saving the city and its people from physical annihilation. Now, how does this take me to Hungary? Paradoxically, the liquidation and biological annihilation of the vast majority of Europe's last intact Jewish community and the third largest Jewish community in Europe was brought about not by Hungary's pronounced pro-German policies, but paradoxically by its anti-German policies that Hungary pursued simultaneously. In 1941, 20,000 Hungarian Jews were thrown over the border into Kamenets-Podolsk, where they were massacred by Germans and Ukrainian helpers. And Jews in Hungary were discriminated against by harsh, reprehensible, slanderous anti-Semitic legislation. But the new Prime Minister, Miklós Kállai, who is often forgotten, refused to carry out the final solution. And if it wasn't for the German invasion in March 1944, there's a strong likelihood at least that this huge community of people would have survived the war. Because without German invasion, that Holocaust would not have taken place on the Kállai. It is also true, though, that it could not have taken place without the active participation of that pro-German government and Hungarian bureaucracy that was put in place after the German invasion in 1944. Now, why invade in 1944? Of course, the intuitive answer is because the Germans were expecting the Red Army's onslaught and were building their defenses. I don't want to go into this detail. I've researched this for almost a decade. But it's a very interesting story and not easy to understand and reconstruct. It was also a story where there was a seeming choice between some kind of an anti-German resistance, if you can call it that, negotiating with the Western allies for a peaceful surrender, taking on the risk of a disastrous German invasion, but the stakes seemed to be, for the Hungarian leadership at the time, national survival, the recurrence of a disastrous peace, and Bolshevization. Would it have been better to sit on the fence and wait out, serve the Germans, continue to serve German needs, militarily, economically, and wait until the war is over? This is a very difficult question. What Kállai and his collaborators in trying to find a way out of the war could not have known was that German invasion was precisely what the Allies wanted to happen. And I have no time to explain why, but the reason was closely interrelated to the invasion of Normandy. And that was a very tricky operation. For it to succeed, and I'm quoting the American chiefs of staff, we need to spread the Germans thin in Normandy. And how can we do that? By convincing the Germans that they need to invade Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. There's not a single sentence that entered the strategic calculations about what the fate of the Jewish community would be if the Germans invaded. So as you see, this is a very, very difficult choice. And I have found that Hitler made up his mind to invade his ally when in December 1943 he found out that the Americans were going to send a high-powered military detachment to Hungary to negotiate a separate peace. And when that unfortunate mission arrived in March 1944, 3 days later, Hitler ordered Operation Margareta. Hungary was invaded, and unfortunately, the rest of the story is well known. The second topic I want to very briefly address is the problem of justice. And István actually says that justice was served, although saying that there were vast numbers of worse than war criminals, sadistic and ruthless murderers. As a wonderful book by Wendy Lowes pointed out, many of them women who perpetrated unspeakable crimes in German occupied territory who were not punished. From Hungary, István brings the example of Winkelmann, who was Hőhere, SS und Polizeiführer in Ungarn. I could bring you another one, Wilhelm Höttl, who had served his Führer as the representative of the German SD in Budapest in 1944. He got away scot-free In 1948, as István points out, this is not the only case, others have done similarly. He worked for the CIC, and even more absurdly for the Israeli intelligence services, only to end up a Reiseführer who would bring Austrian tourists to Budapest in the 1970s. But what about those people who risked their lives to save others? And that's, I think, when I teach, particularly my American students, we grow up in this fairy tale world that the good get their reward. And this was not true in World War II, as you all know. The most moving story, of course, is that of Raoul Wallenberg, who was not only murdered by the Soviets in 1947, but humiliatingly, he was put in a cell together with an SS man. Not that the Soviets cared a single bit about the victims of the Holocaust, because about 10,000 Jews were deported to Soviet gulags who had survived Nazi death camps. And not only was it Wallenberg, but a lesser-known figure, Karol Schandl, who was one of his most important helpers, and he has also worked for British intelligence in World War II. He too, and Wallenberg's driver, Vilmos Langfelder, were also liquidated by the NKVD. What about Pál Szalai? And this is a figure that even Hungarians know almost nothing about, because as István pointed out, and I'm very grateful that he did that in his moving preface on Béla Stollár, that if you were not a communist resistor, you were doomed to be forgotten. And not only was Béla Stollár almost forgotten, but so was Pál Szalai, who was, although a high-ranking member of the Hungarian Aerocross Party, but he helped Raoul Wallenberg save a large number of persecuted Jews in Budapest and was instrumental in saving the Budapest ghetto. The popular court acquitted him in 1945, but in the last craze of Stalinist madness in 1952, he was arrested with former members of the Jewish Council as part and parcel of Stalinist trials, the Zionist trials, and Szalai was convicted to prison, despite the fact that he saved so many people. I think in 1956 he managed to escape and died forgotten in exile. In the very same year he was arrested, in 1952, a man by the name of Ferenc Megadja, and I'm sure that almost no historian, I mean, Gergő is smiling, but few of you will know this name. But Megadja was one of the cruelest, most sadistic Aerocross thugs who participated in killing and torturing Jews in Budapest in 1944. His brother László was hung in 1945, but Ferenc escaped. He was caught by the Stalinist political police in 1952. They knew who this guy was and how many people he murdered, and still he was recruited to serve the Hungarian political police in 1952 as a spy in Yugoslavia. And his reward for murdering, that he was able to flee to Australia, where he began a new life, and organize Nazi life there. So this is crime and punishment after World War II. And the last, and I promise to be very brief, István mentions the workings of the popular courts and says that aside from the Soviet Union, these were not show trials. And the defendants, even if the trials were politically loaded, at least got some kind of defense. And I can affirm that in many trials this was actually the case. Not always, though. And I'll tell you this anecdotal story, this one trial where a defendant was sentenced to 5 years of internment. The problem was that he never showed up to serve his punishment. And they tried to find out why. And the reason was that he had already deceased before the trial, but nobody noticed, not even the judge, that the defendant was not present because he was dead. Because in many of these trials, absolutely no defense was needed or required or even allowed to happen in some of them. Now, what made the difference? In some trials, the judges were conscientious. In others, they were not. In this particular trial, the judge was not. And this, I think, shows a very important aspect of what István discusses throughout the book, that it is impossible to make any generalization about human behavior based on class, based on wealth, based on ethnicity, nationality, or religion. People behave very, very differently. I've looked at hundreds of testimonies of Shoah survivors who came back to Hungary in 1945, who talked about their experience, their harrowing experience in the horrors of Nazi death camps. And they recounted that some of the fellow prisoners could be exceedingly sadistic and cruel. And of course, you can say that they acted in even harsher, under even much harsher conditions than the political pressure on the popular courts in Hungary in 1945. What choice did they have, we could ask. But they also say that there were others who remained human, who gave them food. But, for example, French POWs were known for giving Jews food in German labor camps. So humanity cannot be situational. It cannot depend on the circumstances, on the conditions. When is it conducive to be human, and when does it have a price? That's a choice you cannot make. And I think that the people who saved, not very many, but still a sizable number of Europeans, who saved persecuted people, not just Jews, but gypsies and others, had to make this choice very consciously. To remain human and do what is right, even though when in many countries being human was illegal. Thank you very much.
You want to make a few remarks? Picking up on some of the comments.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I hoped for some very harsh criticism so that I might repudiate it, but I agree with the speaker, and they agree with me. So that we have to avoid having a love festival, and I hope that the audience will be very tough. But there were excellent questions raised, and I cannot even begin to answer them, and certainly I hope that will be in the discussion the real participants, the important participants, will have to say. One or two little things which I wrote down and cannot read now, and the problem is that I hear almost nothing. I'm unfortunately very, very hard of hearing lately. One of the things from Paxton, Bob Paxton, who is my colleague, he was my colleague, but he was in the terms of France, World War II, fascism, he is my teacher, and I'm very grateful to him. And one thing that he mentions, which I also mentioned, that how weak, we shouldn't go too far, but still have to be aware against what the public opinion is, how weak German power was. It started out being weak by the Germans not being armed enough, that French had more tanks, had more artillery, that the Allies, the countries that were later attacked by Germany, if they had combined their forces just on paper and had handed a note to the Germans that we Czechoslovaks, we Norwegians, we Swedes, who are threatened by you, we will respond with force, it's very unlikely that the Germans would have attacked. So that would have been, I would say, that would have been a way to avoid the terrible bloodshed of World War II. Now, the German weakness that they were under-equipped, in fact, they did not even continue armament because Hitler thought in 1940 that somehow the war was over. And they did not continue the armament. The British made a much bigger effort in 1940 than the Germans. The German weakness continues. There are not enough soldiers. Paxton mentioned in one of his books that I think I might be mistaken, 3,600 German gendarmes were in France. And they were supposed to pick up all the Jews. Now, who is going to do it? It's always the locals. So the locals could have avoided it, because there was, and that's a very important point that we perhaps didn't mention, underline enough, but it is in many books already, especially Christopher Browning's books on ordinary men. The Germans did not punish those fellow Germans or SS men who refused to kill. If you accept this as a basic principle, then it is really incomprehensible why more people did not go into passive resistance. The German SS men who refused to shoot and was therefore assigned to kitchen duty exercised a form of very cautious passive resistance. The same could have been done in every country. The Hungarian Jews were deported by, as statistics now seem to show, 200,000 Hungarians, all officials, all employed by the government. And I don't know of a single case when a Hungarian official, be that a doctor or be that an officer or a policeman, would have simply said, I'm not going to do that. It's not my job. It cannot be my job as a mayor of a city to deport my citizens abroad, to send them abroad. Everybody knew that they would go abroad. Everybody knew that they would die. Everybody knew that they wouldn't call back. They could have said, I'm not doing it. I'm sick. So fantastic achievements could have been achieved with a little goodwill, and that was missing. And that's why I'm saying that US, Europe, we understand it, and Hollywood, of course, is very good in criticism. We understand it, but what does it help to understand? We have to see what happens and draw some kind of conclusions, or what she also was talking about, to see that everything is mechanical, everything is biological, and then we might as well sit back and die. And we are not going to do that. We are always going to make a moral judgment. And we say, in this perspective, it's good, and that was bad. Now, what is good and what is bad, it's impossible to say, because I'm sure many of you are devout in whatever religion you have. I'm not. I don't know to whom I am responsible, but I still feel that there should have been much more, in me, for instance, much more courage than I actually showed. In Béla Stola, who became practically my brother-in-law, there was a lot of conscience, but when I look at his correspondence, I see that there were moments of weakness in him, very, very serious weakness, because he was also thinking of his career. So you take the whole picture together and said he was a wonderful man, and no wonderful man is without weaknesses and hesitation, but he was able to do it for no reason. What caused Béla Stola to give up his life? He has no reason. His origin was perfectly acceptable. He was a nice guy. He would have been a nice career as a journalist, as a sport journalist. He was very talented in many ways, an incredible memory. He would have a nice career. He wouldn't have, nobody would have forced him to be a murderer or to join the Aerocross. It was very easy not to join the Aerocross, by the way, last few months. He would have made a nice career under communism, but he would never have made a nice career because he was always a man of conscience. So I think we have to come up with this conclusion that conscience is something fantastic that we should all at least respect. Now, László, of course, he brings up issues that are burning issues for every Hungarian and even ex-Hungarian. I just would like to warn, this is not a meeting about Hungary, even though many of us Hungarians, it's not a meeting. Nor is it about Jews. Of course, the sort of the test that one always puts involved in one says, so what did they do to the Jews? What could they have and what did they do to the Jews? And in this respect, as I try to say in the book, the certificate, the result is always very mixed. You cannot find a single case of a country, of a government which is pure. None. Poland would have, one could say, the Poles were poor because they did not collaborate. But the Poles, many of them, maybe millions of them, hated the Jews and tried to kill them and had to get rid of them because they also had an overwhelming goal. Poland for the Poles, that was the great slogan of the National Democrats, who were the most active and most popular party, and became very popular even after World War II. Even under communism, they were very strong, that kind of nationalist. And they wanted to get rid of the ethnic minorities, and the Jews were the first to go, and the Germans were the second to go. So, but you cannot say that the Poles who like to see themselves, Polish intellectuals in New York, oh, we never collaborated. Oh, yes, I did this, I did that. I was concentration camp. I lost my arm in the fight. It's wonderful. We should all be ashamed when we look at the Polish resistance, as I had the opportunity when they were still alive. But it's cannot say that the Polish resistance was a pure affair. And that applies, of course, to all others. It was easier, of course, to resist in Western Europe, as we said, because in Western Europe, as I say rather facetiously, what happened? Nothing happened. The Germans came, the people looked at them, here are the Germans. The women came into the street, many of them immediately associated with the German soldiers. Otherwise, why would we have 20,000, 30,000 German children in Norway and in Holland and in Denmark? And then there was a little bit of discontent, resistance, and then the Canadians came to Holland and liberated it, and everything was fine and dandy. I mean, everything in Eastern Europe was different. It was a million times worse, and that's why, I mean, Tim Snyder is right, bloodland is maybe not the right expression, but the idea that this is where the war was really fought and where the outcomes were decisive. And one of the decisive outcomes was the victory of the Soviet Union, with all its bad or good consequences, and we have to accept it. The Americans, and this is about László, of course, this discussion is going on, his theory is very interesting and fantastically researched about how the Americans wanted the Hungarians to resist, and in order to facilitate the landing in Normandy is a very important thesis. There are some objections to this in Hungary. Some people are very agitated about it. This is very, very, very interesting. I cannot really comment on it, but I would say that it really didn't make any difference. It was a very minor issue. The important issue was that the Allies had to land. They had to land for many reasons. And one of the reasons was, and we like it or not, we have to admit it, because the Soviets were winning the war. And they didn't want the Soviets to win alone. Thank God that the Soviets had this problem on hand, the American and British landings. And because otherwise, even for them, it would have been bad to occupy Paris. They would not have survived this culture shock and everything else. Overall, I would say that things happened the way it had to happen. And at the end of the war, I would argue that overall justice was served. Again, we must go into millions of details, and we will find, beginning the Nuremberg trial, in which some people were hanged, probably, with very little justification, and thousands of others were not hanged in Germany. Germany, after all, escaped the purges better than any other country. But overall, the whole idea that you have to punish people individually, not the country, which was always done. What is Versailles? What was the 1871 treaty against France by Prussia? Punishing the country, which means always punishing the poor people, the taxpayer who has to pay the indemnity, the country which has an economy suffers. That's what was happening. Now, the first time they say this leader is responsible, Antonescu is responsible, and he was shot. Horthy was responsible. He escaped it. Well, of course, it always happens. The worst, Ante Pavelic, the real horrible, murderous tyrant of Croatia, who has not one, I cannot say one good thing about him. He ended happily in his life in Madrid. and was probably helped by the Vatican. That's another story, by the way, the behavior of Pius XII and his whole crew there. But that doesn't mean that there was not an attempt, at least, at justice, and many people were given their punishment. And conceivably, next time they will think twice about it before they start killing others. One has to be very cynical, of course, because life is not fair, not just. And it is. One more thing I wanted to say. Another aspect which you might find if you're interested, one of the most important development in World War II is the growth of the irregular armies, the non-disciplined, non-uniformed, secretly operating armies. Again, for better and worse, I'm not against the resistance, but the resistance brings about incredible problems and incredible suffering. Whether it's Béla Stolar, whose resistance act and heroic death inadvertently caused the death of a few Jews who were hiding in the same house and they didn't know anything about it. Suddenly the arrow cross comes and shoots them because they found out that they were Jews. Or as in Rome, by example I give, the attempt in the Via Rosella against the Italian communists who place a bomb in the way of a German company and kill 33 people, whereupon the Germans execute 335 totally innocent Italians. So resistance is a terrible dilemma for those who engage in it, but I don't want to say that one shouldn't do it. Thank you.
Gather some questions, keep them fairly brief, and let me start with you, sir. Yes, please. You should go to the mic there because it allows then Professor Deák to hear.
Hi, my name is Borhi. I come from Kosovo. And my question is two-pronged. A short question is, did land lease, American land lease, play a very important role in Russian winnings?
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I know nothing about land lease. Second, I think the question should be addressed.
Well, that is American aid in arms and armaments.
Yes, yeah, go fit another question you have.
Yeah. Well, it's a very legitimate question, I think. And also, the second question is that did Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, had a negative impact into the Balkans with his policies of protecting the British Empire after the Second World War?
I didn't hear the beginning of that question. Churchill.
Did Prime Minister Churchill had a negative impact in course of the Second World War into the Balkan region with his policies of protecting British Empire after the Second World War? Being that in case of Albania, he told us that he had the December Declaration. He told us, well, after the Second World War, we're going to chop your little country, we're going to give it to the Greece, parts of it, and our elite, who was very well educated in the West, told him, go to hell. So we're not going to fight the Germans. So.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes.
Edmund Reiter. Professor Deák said that Poland refused to cooperate with Hitler. In 1935, Hitler invited the Polish ambassador to the Chancellery. And that was in 1938. And he suggested that Poland attack Czechoslovakia, because Poland and Czechoslovakia had a territorial dispute over Teschen. And then Hitler added a sweetener. If you attack Czechoslovakia, we are going to help you to get rid of the Jews. Poland attacked Czechoslovakia in 1938, got chastened, and of course the ambassador also said, her chance, if you help us to get rid of the Jews, we'll build you the most beautiful monument of the heart of Warsaw.
I'm going to ask you a short question.
Yeah.
So one question.
Well, the question is, how can you say Poland didn't collaborate?
Okay, that's the question. Now, yes, sir.
This is not really a question. No, István said that shouldn't be a Hungarian meeting, but László quoted Sándor Márai, a Hungarian writer, very briefly, so I would like to give the 2 sentences quotation, and us who lived under Russian occupation after the war, we appreciate it. Márai said that the Russians liberated everybody who were discriminated against, imprisoned, and sent to concentration camps to die. The Russian soldiers liberated them, but they couldn't bring them freedom because they did not have any.
Some of the more recent studies on the war in Europe, and then thinking about the collaboration, the retribution, are bringing into the question of American bombing, and how that sometimes fits in to a structure which, in the case of your book, I mean, it's so fundamental. It's dealing with such these ethical fundamentals. So it is a question that you seem to want to address, and I was wondering too if István could conceive of a way in which that question could be addressed in the framework of your book. Oh, Holly, you might want to start, and then perhaps István.
Do these work? Oh, they do. Okay. I'd just like to respond to the gentleman who said, who asked Professor Deák how he can say that Poland didn't collaborate. He actually did say that just about everyone collaborated. One of the really wonderful and frustrating things about this book is it's very typical István. He'll say, you know, and here are instances in which people are behaving heroically, but there's always the case where they don't actually behave that heroically. He talked about Polish anti-Semitism. He talked about Teshin. It's in the book. So I encourage you to read the book because it has this wonderful, I think, stylistic tick of István's, which is to say something quite authoritatively and then to, you know, say qualify it right immediately thereafter, oftentimes in 3 or 4 ways. And that's, I think, what makes it such a wonderful book. I think Vicky's question is wonderful. And I was trying to think how one would approach the issue, because this is a book about Europe, right? And so it's not about the United States, it's not about Japan. But on some level, when we talk about a world war, we're already talking about things that are interconnected. I think Professor Borhi alluded to this in the thesis that he put forward about the nature of the relationship between the possible relationship between the Hungarian, German occupation of Hungary and the American landing in Normandy. And I think there is also a relationship, at least we should probe it or seek to glean the relationship between various occupation practices in the Pacific and in other parts, non-European theaters of war, and what's happening in Europe proper. And also, it's not simply the United States, but it's also Great Britain that's involved in the bombing and that derives a policy. And one thing that I find particularly fascinating is how Britain is almost not European for the purposes of this book, and maybe for the purposes of the war. And I would like to raise that as a question, because the British come in. I think István Deák mentions the secret intelligence organizations that try to coordinate anti-Nazi attacks. But there's really no discussion of what's happening on British terrain specifically. Except the Channel Islands. Yeah, the Channel Islands is a significant episode, but it's significant precisely because it's such a strange one. And so on the subject of the carpet bombing, I also think this ties into a matter where some of the moral challenges of speaking about victims and perpetrators in one breath. You know, to what extent does victimization cancel perpetratorship, or is it possible to talk about victimization without in some way canceling perpetratorship? This is a theme that has preoccupied a lot of people, not least of all the German writer W.G. Sebald, who wrote a book on the natural history of destruction about the bombings, not to mention, you know, people like Kurt Vonnegut, who writes Slaughterhouse 5, and that's an American who was on the ground as a POW watching the bombings take place from that perspective. So I definitely think these things are interrelated. I would love to hear István's perspective on how, because he certainly knows a lot about American involvement, and he also knows a fair bit about the Pacific Theater. And so I would love to hear how he thinks about these things together.
Bob, do you want to speak?
I'll comment very quickly on the Lend-Lease issue. At the time of D-Day, Stalin had agreed to make a counterattack, and he did. He launched this offensive called Operation Bagration, which was wildly successful and went all the way to the Vistula, to the gates of Warsaw. And one reason that he moved so much faster in the summer of '44 than he had moved in the summer of '43 was he had 220,000 Studebaker trucks. And so Lend-Lease made a huge difference in that instance, but that's a detail. I want to ask István to respond to the bombing.
István, do you want to respond to the question around bombing that, well, come here.
I feel I should say much more because all my knowledge and everything I have to say is in the book. Also now I'm being reminded of all the things I did not say and I should say. And then next time, but there is no next time, I should write a very big book. American involvement, this is the typical case when a power which at that moment in from 1942 to 1945 is basically a good power fighting a good war. If you don't believe this, then we cannot talk about this issue any longer. Well, this good power fighting a good war does ugly things. That actually, every good power does terrible things. Every human being does, especially which has the power of the world in his hands, will do bad things. One will be to use the miserable little East European countries for little tactical purposes. A few German divisions, maybe they will be diverted to Budapest. The other is that, yes, they behave abominably when it comes to German criminals. That is abominable. It's the Cold War. The Cold War, for which, in my opinion, the Americans are just as responsible as the Soviets. Some of you might not like this, but the Soviet Union occupied territories which I wouldn't say belonged to them, but they had them. They had the power. They had the army. They had 20 million people whom they sacrificed for this. They had millions armies, and so occupied some East European countries. Aside from Poland, which is, I would say, innocent, The Hungarians were not innocent, or the Romanians. I hear them complaining all the time. All those Russian bandits came and take. But where would they have gone? How can they win the war if they not come through Hungary? They have to come through Hungary because Hungary attacked and Romania attacked and Finland attacked and Croatia attacked and Slovakia attacked the Soviet Union. What do they expect? To lose the war, then the other enemy will come. They're primitive? Naturally they're primitive. That's how it is. Kazakhs are not Germans. Would be nice. If everybody would be as smart and as well educated and as clean as wonderfully coordinated as the Germans, but they aren't. So I would say, well, that's long story, thank God or not. In any case, they were not. So they behave. Some of them behave abnormally. The Soviet commanders were terrible. They let their people. That is a crime. They should have tried to stop them, whether they was able or not. They came to Budapest. Who would have stopped them? How would you have stopped them? There's a city with 900,000 people. Every cellar has civilians in it. Every cellar has women in it. Every cellar has some food in it, maybe some medicine. The Russians were running around for medicine because they all had venereal disease from all their raping. Yes, it's terrible, but they hoped to get some Salvarsan. That was the great slogan of the day. Where is the Salvarsan? I don't know whether it was worth anything. But that's an army of several million people who walked, who lived under terrible conditions, who did not have a movie team going with them, who didn't have swimming pools going with them as the Americans had. They had nothing. Yes, they had trunks. It's not enough. They had cans. So they sacks. The cords on their back and the sack. And the sack, there was 2 American cans. Let's see, I would like to see American soldiers who are willing to march 2,000 kilometers from 3,000 from Stalingrad with nothing. Of course they misbehaved, but they should not have. They should have. It's a very bad thing. But that's what happened. We have to accept it. They accepted it. They occupied these countries. They wanted Poland. This is an issue which will never be settled, whether they did it justifiably or not, whether Churchill was right or wrong to give in to them finally, but Roosevelt was right or not. I cannot even begin to answer this question. But after all, they took Poland, and the world was relatively at peace for the next 40 or 50 years. Yes, the American moment. I wrote another number here, but I didn't have anything. I forgot to add my comments. Oh, the bombing, yes. But we know these arguments also. The bombing worse, the bombing better, but the same thing as concentration camp. The people who died, and Sebald and other Germans, now Friedrich write about this all the time. Terrible. A firestorm was as bad as the gas chambers in Auschwitz in terms of how they died. But it still was an act of war. The killing of innocent people just because they are Jews or because they are gypsies is not an act of war, it's mass murder. We still have to make this difference. Hiroshima was terrible, Nagasaki was terrible, but was an act of war. The Japanese were not nice, the Germans were not nice in a war, the Americans are not nice, the British are nice. This is how war fought. Fought with every method at their disposal. They all violated the Hague Agreement. Open cities should not have been bombed. They all signed this agreement in 1897, then 1907 again. They all violated it. But at least they were fighting a war, and they were trying to save their own citizens. And the British, by the way, I just want to mention this, the British were very careful during World War II. So there's not much to say about them. They tried to fight the war, yes, with the blood of others. It's not very glorious, but they lost 1 million or more men in the First World War. They wanted to avoid it. So I firmly believe that people should not be punished for bombing, even though one feels terribly sorry about them. By the way, I had, in 1944, I made good friends with a German soldier. He was 17. I only remember his first name, Helmut. Helmut knew that he would die because Budapest is besieged. He knew But he told me that his parents were dead, they were killed in the bombing of Cologne. It's terrible. I feel still today, my heart bleeds for him. But he was a German, and it was an act of war that he should be killed.
Okay, now I'm looking for a little variety here. Students, women, we haven't had any women. Would you ask a question? Yeah. Go ahead. I'd like.
Shall I? I'll try to be.
Very brief, okay? Very brief.
I'll try.
No, not try. We need one question.
I think Veblen said we should, the social scientists, should judge not but explain mightily. I hope we're doing that. Professor Paxton raised the point, how do the few control the many? How many British soldiers did it take to control India and the empire? But to get back to resistance, I understand 40,000 Budapest Jews were saved by an Italian merchant who took over the embassy when the diplomats left. Boris of Bulgaria saved 12,000. He was an ally by not obeying Hitler's command to send them. But nobody has mentioned the German resistance, the Rosenstrasse incident, the Gebrüder Scholl.
Okay, that's good question. Thanks. Now let me hear the next question. We just have a couple lined up. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Anna Bayer, and first, yeah, you hear me?
A little bit lower.
Yeah. Okay. So my name is Anna Bayer, and as Ambassador Kumin is here, I would like to take the opportunity to protest against the shameful German occupation memorial in Budapest. And I have a question to Mr. Borhi, as he's working for the Hungarian Science Academy. And the question is about the preamble of the Hungarian Constitution, which states, we consider that the state sovereignty of Hungary lost on March 19, 1944, was regained on May 2nd, 1990. The Hungarian government functioned all through the summer of 1944, while the deportations and the annihilation of Hungarian Jewish population was taking place. Don't you think that the preamble to the Constitution overlooks this sovereign action by the former head of state of Hungary?
Thank you. Next question.
But shall I answer, or?
We'll wait for a few more.
Quick question for Professor Deak, who mentioned that the Stasi leader was given safe passage to Madrid, maybe with Vatican assistance. What about the CIA using Klaus Barbie in South America and their involvement in using collaborators in the Cold War? Anyway, just a small.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question for Professor Deak that goes to the suggestions for further reading section of his book. What principles of inclusion and exclusion did you use? And specifically, why no mention of the works of Professor Marek Jan Chodakevich, either his local study, you mentioned Jan Grabowski's local study, or Chodakevich's books that criticize the method of Professor Jan Thomas Gross?
Seems to me that there was a blur between individual responsibility and collective responsibility. Holly Case made a case that there are only two ways, predetermined or completely free. Well, neurobiology teaches us that's not so simple. And so I would like you to clarify, Professor Deak, to Holly Case, how does individual responsibility contribute to collective responsibility, which comes up here and there. Are there sinful nations, or are sinful nations composed of immoral citizens? That's the question.
And I'm not a historian, and I would like to ask a question to the panel. István writes a very interesting little chapter on Channel Islands, which is a special case. My question is a theoretical, and usually historians don't like theoretical questions. What would be the retribution, resistance, and other factors if the Germans would have occupied Great Britain or England, and would it follow the Channel Island example, or would it have been a different case? Thank you.
Drinks and celebrate.
So I think that the question was driving at what the question was trying to drive at is whether I consider the Hungarian administration of 1944 responsible for the Holocaust, and I do. And there's nothing about sovereignty. We could go into Stephen Krasner's notion of Westphalian versus international legal sovereignty. It's not the point. The point is that the Hungarian administration, the Hungarian government, Hungarian bureaucracy, the gendarmerie took a very active part in the Holocaust. And the Germans could not have carried this out without that participation. We really, really have to make that clear. Whether we lost our sovereignty to the Germans, to the Soviets, is a completely different matter. I don't know if this is a satisfactory answer, but...
Yes, thank you for the questions. First of all, to the person who said that German resistance wasn't discussed, it is actually discussed in an entire chapter of the book, and it's a very interesting treatment that deals with German resistance. So it's towards the end of the book, and it's incredibly, I learned something from it, so I would refer you to the book for that. On the subject of individual versus collective responsibility, I think that's an excellent question. I think the querist suggested that I made this distinction. It was Thomas Sass who made the distinction between total responsibility and absolute causality, the scientific versus the philosophical. And he actually said that, you know, none of those two, as I pointed out, is entirely verifiable, and that he made a moral choice for the latter, that it, you know, and rather than some combination. But that was his choice. It was also Hannah Arendt's choice when she faced Adolf Eichmann, or when she was talking about Eichmann, because even though she said he was not a Bluebeard in the dock, he wasn't a monster, he was still culpable. He was an ordinary, he was, you know, this is what she gets criticized for, but she cast him as kind of a pencil pusher, a bureaucrat. But even if he's just a cog in the machine, she wanted to make the case that he was responsible for what he had done, even if he existed in a world where morality was topsy-turvy. And so I think World War II calls out the extremes of these two positions, either absolute blamelessness on the grounds that causality locks you into a particular position, or absolute blame. And I would love to have a conversation about, you know, like, will we ever get to the point when we talk about World War II where we can let go of that dichotomy? Because I think that, you know, what would that mean for our treatment of World War II? I think, on the one hand, I think it would be a great release from the kind of rug between the teeth that we've all got in connection with the ideologization of criminal responsibility in World War II. But I don't know what the trajectory of letting go of that rug would be. And but probably it will happen eventually, so we'll see.
Bob, final.
Well, I'll take up a few, but not all of the questions that have been left floating. Every victorious power used German technicians after the war. The Soviet Union did, the French did, the British did, the Americans did. They employed German technicians in rocketry and in other matters, or as sources of information about communism as the Cold War settled in. It was, of course, almost impossible to pass from the horrors of war to an innocent peace. It simply wasn't going to happen, and every nation engaged in that kind of recruitment, every victorious nation. The Channel Islands and Britain, it's everyone's favorite guessing game. Obviously, we don't know. The passivity of the Channel Islands, of which István makes an interesting subchapter, is everyone's is a favorite subject of irony. The Channel Islands were instructed to keep calm, and they did. And nothing in 1940 or even 41, nothing much could have been gained by shooting a German soldier, or the war wouldn't have been shortened by it, and the occupation of the Channel Islands would have become much bloodier. This issue haunted the resistance from the very beginning to the end. Is it better to wait until a resistance action can actually have a tactical impact at the battle level or a strategic impact at the war level before one endangers one's neighbors? Because when you committed a serious resistance act, you usually condemn your neighbors to the reprisals that are going to follow. So a great many of the leaders of exiled governments and groups like the Home Army in Poland, their advice to their fellow resistance was prepare yourselves, but do not act until you're able to make a great difference. And certainly in the Channel Islands you couldn't do that. Now in the French case, and in other cases, in June 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the communist parties of Europe entered into the resistance. Up until that time, the official communist position had been Churchill, Hitler, it makes no difference. They're both at the head of capitalist states. The City of London is the same thing as the banks of Frankfurt. And so the proper position for the working people is to fraternize with the German soldiers. This was a position which a great many communist militants loathed and despised, but it was the official position. Suddenly, on the 22nd of June, 1941, that stopped and was reversed to the great joy of communist militants. And in a matter of weeks, to take the French case, the communist underground had begun assassinating German officers. The first one was, I think, the 22nd of August, 1941, in a subway station in Paris. Communist resistors assassinated a German naval cadet, a young man. And there were other assassinations in the military occupation of France, which had tried to keep things relatively calm. I mean, they were ruthless if they caught somebody cutting a cable or whatnot. There were a fair number of death sentences. But at this point, the reprisals really took off. The order was 50 to 100 hostages will be shot for every German soldier killed. And so the death toll went up violently. Now, this is... there was a huge debate. De Gaulle thought this was a very bad thing to do. The resistance had never resolved this decision about whether one should wait until you could make a difference or whether you must make the demonstration, must provoke, indeed, the cruelty of the occupier to hasten the end of the war. That conflict was never resolved. Let me. I'll just end with a sentence or two about bombing. It's an unanswerable conundrum, like resistance in a way. There is no under wartime circumstances. There's no way to do it bloodlessly. I think that the bombing had a history. It began with Guernica in Spain, which was terror bombing, a market town wiped out on market day in the Basque Country, simply as an act of terror. The next step was the terror bombing, carpet bombing of Rotterdam, followed by Coventry. Under those circumstances, the Allies were not particularly delicate about their use of bombing on the other side, but there was a huge debate about whether one bombed strategic targets, ball-bearing factories, synthetic oil factories, or whether one bombed residential neighborhoods to try to break the morale of the German workers. And only the Americans had the Norden bomb site, and the Americans tried to bomb strategic targets. It was a failure. They always hit the hospital next door. And so the net result wasn't all that different. But of course it was a failure. It did not break the resistance of the German workers. The factories were put underground. And in the end, one could, I think, argue that these were crimes of war when you bomb the general population. But the debates about this on the Allied side are quite interesting. I think they were quite clear about the stakes, and yet the overwhelming need was to break this extraordinary German military power, and so that's what they did.
May I just say just one thing briefly in connection, because I think what the last person to ask a question said something about Klaus Barbie and the CIA. I just wanted to add also that these ironies are also in István's book related to the way that people reinvented themselves after the war. So not only in Germany, but also the way that the Western allies, including the United States, made ample use of former Nazis in running the administration, but also for their own purposes. So this does come up in the book as well.
Okay, well, we want to thank you for having written this book and allowing us to talk about it. And thank you for your contributions. And I think, without further ado, I want to applaud you, István, applaud our contributors here, and then we're going to adjourn to more celebrations.